And we are joined now by NBC News senior White House correspondent Garrett Haake, former Republican Congressman Charlie Dent, and former U.S. Attorney, MSNBC legal analyst Joyce Vance. Garrett, this is the second time in a week now that President Trump and Elon Musk have had a high-profile joint appearance. What exactly is the strategy here?
Well, I think there are a couple of pieces to it. First, I think there's an effort to put a sort of patina of transparency on the work that they've been doing largely behind the scenes to reform the federal workforce. Second, to put a friendlier face on what have been mass firings around the government. And I think third, to show that they can't be separated, that these two are presenting a united front, and that, attacks from Democrats about Musk as sort of the co-president, or complaints that he is an unelected person doing the work of the president, don't seem to be bothering them. Musk described his role in a way that I think is useful for people to understand, too, essentially saying he is part tech support and part enforcer, that he sees it as his job to make sure that the executive orders that the president is signing are actually getting followed through upon. But this, as we've learned just this week, that his role is technically just that of a senior advisor. He has no independent authority of his own beyond his suggestions to the president.
And speaking of executive orders, Garrett, President Trump signed one executive order giving him more power over independent regulatory agencies. What exactly will this do, and how does it change the current structure or the way things work normally?
Yeah, Anna, it's not entirely clear, frankly, how this is going to play out in practice. But the theory here is that some of these nominally independent agencies that fall under the executive branch, like the Federal Trade Commission or the FEC, where you typically see a president nominate a person to take over or persons to take over for these commissions for some period of time, and then take a more hands-off approach as those agencies go about their work. This executive order, this memo, essentially says these agencies are going to work through the White House, through the executive, and that they can't take positions that are contrary to what the White House believes. This goes hand in glove with Musk's theory here that the bureaucracy ought to report directly through Donald Trump, exact only his will, essentially, in doing what they do. How this shows up in the day-to-day workings of these agencies, I think we're only going to find out over time. And I think we're probably going to find out in the form of lawsuits that will be filed when these things clash with the expectations of how these agencies are run and the duties that they have to perform around the country.
All right, Garrett Haake, thanks for bringing us the latest. More lawsuits expected. Joyce, in that joint interview, President Trump and Elon Musk weighed in on some controversies over potential conflicts of interest. Let's watch.
I mean, I haven't asked the president for anything ever.
And if it comes up, how will you handle it?
Well,
he won't be involved.
Yeah, I'll recuse myself if it is.
If there's a conflict, he won't be involved.
Yeah,
I mean, I wouldn't want that, and he won't want it.
Okay, it sounds good, but we know it's not that simple. New York Times had reported just last week at least 11 federal agencies that have been affected by DOGE moves have more than 32 continuing investigations, pending complaints, and enforcement actions into Musk's 6 companies. Plus, we now have the Department of Transportation soliciting input from SpaceX on air traffic control. There's Trump's order to eliminate the electric vehicle subsidy, which you could argue helps Tesla by potentially reducing some of its competition. Joyce, aren't we already seeing conflicts?
There's a big gap, Anna, between what they're saying and what they're doing. And the fact that they claim that there's no conflict that they'll recuse is just really put to the lie by what we're seeing in practice. As a federal employee, I wasn't able to participate in any sort of activity, even if I owned stock in a company. And as the congressman knows very well, federal employees report those conflicts. And especially if you're working at a high level, they're made public so that everyone can see them. There's a real failure of transparency here.
Musk laid out his top line goal for DOGE. Let's watch that part of the interview.
Well, the overall goal is to try to get $1 trillion out of the deficit. And if the deficit is not brought under control, America will go bankrupt. This is a very important thing for people to understand.
So just to reiterate that, Congressman, he wants to cut $1 trillion. President Trump, just this morning, is calling on Congress to pass a budget that calls for $4.5 trillion in new deficits through tax cuts. Look, math's never been my strength, but I know those numbers don't add up if the goal is to reduce the deficit.
Well, there's certainly an incoherence here. On the one hand, Elon Musk is saying we're going to cut spending by $1 trillion. Last I checked, that was the role of the Congress that has the power of the purse authority on both revenue and expenditure. They're the ones who should be doing this. In fact, I think DOGE is misnamed. Department of Government Efficiency ought to be called the Department of Governmental Downsizing, because that seems to be what they're doing. And by the way, I have no problem with a reduction in force exercise, but it should be done thoughtfully after a review process, not arbitrarily and capriciously as it's been done here. And it's very haphazard. So I have all sorts of issues here. So on the one hand, we're talking about cutting the budget deficit by $1 trillion, but the president's budget obviously doesn't reflect that, because he's going to have to find money in places like Medicare, Social Security, Defense, and Medicaid. I don't think he wants to put those on the table right now.
When you talk about the downsizing, Congressman, in recent days, we know Trump has fired critical workers that were involved in overseeing America's nuclear stockpile. Then he scrambled to unfire them. The Department of Agriculture fired staffers handling the national bird flu response. Now trying to rescind those firings. Congressman, Republicans, we know, have been wanting to shrink the federal government for decades. Is this the way they wanted to do it?
No, these firings are being done indiscriminately. To fire those who oversee the national nuclear stockpile is insane. Getting rid of these folks at USDA who are helping us combat the bird flu epidemic is also crazy. You're hearing many Republican leaders now speak up. You know, the NIH right now is being affected by something called indirect cost recovery, but basically it's going to affect the ability to do medical research at places like, the University of Alabama. So you're hearing Senator Britt and others speak up. So I think a lot of Republicans are really having problems with this. Mike Simpson of Idaho talking about the changes or cuts to the national parks. Many employees of his out in Idaho. There are all sorts of things happening here that are just wrong-headed. I mean, if they want to do a strategic downsizing, that's one thing. That's not what they're doing. This is completely indiscriminate across the board. And by the way, they fired the inspectors, many of the inspectors general, whose job it is to identify waste, fraud, and abuse on an independent basis. And they fired them. They should be allies of DOGE and efficiency, but they're not even being considered. Hell, they're being fired.
Well, DOGE actions have triggered dozens of lawsuits, including by some of those fired inspector generals. A federal judge did deliver a win, though, for President Trump yesterday. 14 states, led by Democrat AGs, sued, trying to block DOGE from accessing data systems or making personnel moves. But Judge Tanya Chutkan said there wasn't proof of imminent harm at this point. Judge Chutkan is the same judge, everybody remembers, who was overseeing Trump's 2020 election interference case. Joyce, what do you make of this ruling, especially given the history there?
Well, this ruling has nothing to do with the substance of the case. This is a preliminary skirmish where the attorneys generals went into court trying to get a temporary restraining order that would freeze the status quo for the next few days while they tee up the early stages of the litigation. She found that they hadn't met their burden of proof, but she also had some discouraging comments for the Trump administration about where this case might ultimately head. I wouldn't read too much into this early ruling.
Yeah, let me just read at least part of what she did say, because I think it's important just for the context there. She said that the suit did, quote, legitimately call into question what appears to be the unchecked authority of an unelected individual and an entity that was not created by Congress over which it has no oversight. So more to come in that case. Also, Joyce, in some of these back and forth filings that we saw yesterday, we learned, at least through one DOJ filing, that Musk is not technically the administrator of DOGE. He isn't even really on the organizational chart, though, even though we all know he's the de facto point person overseeing the effort. So what are we to make of that? Is that just a legal technicality? What's the purpose of saying, well, he's overseeing it, but he's not really a part of it?
You know, this isn't a legal technicality. This is serious business, because when the government files pleadings in front of a court, they are obligated to be truthful. So here they've said that Musk has a limited role, but Donald Trump has referred to Musk as the person who is running DOGE. And those two statements are diametrically opposed. I would expect that we will begin to see federal judges dig deeper on this and seek clarification on Musk's status, because you can't continue to have it both ways. You can't be official when it suits you and unofficial when it doesn't suit you. This is, in essence, they're trying to give Musk as much room as possible to roam without having to confront government accountability procedures, and that's just not sustainable.
Well, there are lots of layers to all of this. It's complicated. Thank you both for helping us find our way. Appreciate you, former Congressman Charlie Dent and Joyce Vance.